World building in general can easily fall into this trap of overdoing itself. Use this information to make your story about your characters better, to make it stand out more, to make the maps for your story look better and stuff like that. The point is not replace all of your prose with world building. Like that would be ridiculous. Take the knowledge and go into the writing armed with it so that you can insert it into places where it makes sense to do so.
Welcome once again to the Pint and Portal Author Podcast. We have a fantastic conversation coming your way today. I am sitting here, computer to computer, with Adam Bassett here today. You may remember him from the previous iteration of my podcast, The Greatest Podcast in the Multiverse. It's been a few years since we chatted. Back then we were chatting a bit about cyberpunk and your book that had released then. But today we are chatting with, and there it is, Digital Extremities. Fantastic book filled with short stories, interconnected short stories. I really did enjoy it. But today we're talking about something a bit different. We're talking to authors and we're talking about world building. And I am really excited to have you here today, Adam.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you are so welcome. So, Adam, for those who may not know who you are or may have missed our previous conversation, and it's been a while.
Yeah.
Give us a bit of a sense of who you are as a writer. And let's start with that and just give us a bit of background, how you got started in writing.
Yeah, so the short version is basically I've kind of always been interested in writing ever since I was very young and took a stab at it in around 2015 or so. I took a long break after that, and I've really come back and made a serious effort with self-publishing since 2024, which is when Digital Extremities came out. My cyberpunk book followed that up the following year, just a few months after, with Animus Paradox, which is like a John Wick spin on that story, because I can't stick to one genre. And because I can't stick to one genre, earlier this year I released Copperskin, Oaken Lungs, which is my post-apocalyptic fantasy story. I'm working on book 2 to that right now. But next up is going to be an author's guide to setting design, world building, and cartography, which is an extremely literal title for my first nonfiction book. It's a reference guide for other authors and game masters and anybody who is building a world, who wants to dig deeper into the world building of it, really focused on map design. You definitely, you don't have to build your own map. It is not going to tell you that you need a map and you have to make it and all that kind of stuff. But I think through maps, we can talk about world building in a lot of interesting ways. And if you do want to build that map, the final third of the book is basically all it's not a how to draw book by any means. I'm not going to tell you how to draw mountains, but the book will tell you how mountains work, where they can appear, how mountain ranges can occur around the world in different ways, the effects that they can have on people who live near them, both strategic, they can form defensive lines for a country. They can also provide resources like different ores. They can provide different habitats for different creatures and plants and all those kinds of things. They are barriers to travel. And all of those things can be represented on your map. And when you are designing that map, what should the typography be? What should the colors be? I think even as we get into a map and we're especially talking about fantasy and science fiction here, I think we kind of sometimes get trapped into the idea of, well, all of the other fantasy maps look like this, and so mine also has to look like this. But no, if your mountain story is really focused on traveling through that space, maybe you need a map showing the elevation, like a physical map or a topographic map. We also, if you are doing a story about pirates, give me a nautical map. Give me something that they would be using. And I think I'm just going to give this to everybody because I want it to exist in the world and I know I'm not going to write it. I think we really need a cozy fantasy story that takes place with a character who is a postman riding a dragon and we give you a zip code map.
Nice.
I just think that would be neat.
That would be fun. That would be so unique. Yeah, it would definitely be unique and a lot of fun too. And definitely a cozy fantasy book. But and that's so I mean, tons of great information there and tons of great, a great starting point. Let's back up just a touch though. So how did you get interested in world building and using cartography to develop story? Like when did this start for you?
I can't pinpoint like when it started, but I do know there were a couple of points at which like I just really fell in love with the maps that I found in the books that I was reading. A really big moment of that for me was first with the old Warrior Cats series of books where they had like the map of what was essentially like a few backyards and then a forest and some plains. And it's such a mundane place, but the way that it's presented is through the eyes of the cats. And it's like this big, wondrous world. And then, of course, much later, as I got into epic fantasy, I really, really loved the maps in Brian McClellan's Powder Mage series, especially in the first book. You get this like lovely map of Adro. And after the events of book one, I won't spoil it, but there's something that happens on top of a mountain, which is like this hugely devastating event. And when you get book two, the map for the same setting shows that the top of that mountain is gone. And that little change reflecting the events of the story was such a cool thing to me. And as I got into writing my own epic fantasy, and of course, like this never saw the light of day, but it was a passion project of mine for years, and it helped me get into writing. And I would explore different things through different projects. But I really loved writing fantasy, and pretty much anytime I would start a new project, I would make a map for it first because it helped me understand the place that I was writing in. And that's still true to this day. Like I basically create a map for everything that I write. I mean, Copperskin, Oaken Lungs I was experimenting with a little bit of a different, more hand-drawn style in this. And I hope this isn't coming up awful with my camera. It's not the best, but
we can see it. Our audio listeners if you're not watching on YouTube, you'll need to go check out the video. But that's all good. You've got so he's holding up the map now of Central Italy.
Yeah,
and,
so
obviously a futuristic setting.
For the cyberpunk books, obviously you need a little bit of a different style or roadmap. Makes more sense for that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just always been a part of my process. And in more recent years, I've gotten into illustrating maps for other people as well. I've done maps for Darby Harn and for Natalie Wright and a bunch of other people. I'm working on, I just did a map for GJ Terrell for He Who Ate the Wild. So yeah, I've just been getting more into that, especially this year. As I've had some time open up, I've been able to do more of that, which has been really cool. And as I was working on a project for a previous job, it involved some discussion of map design and things like that. And it just sort of occurred to me, like, I have more to say about this than I thought I did. And I was a little bit inspired by Tim Hickson's Hello Future Me's collections of video essays that he's kind of like edited down into a book that you can like pick up and read. The On World Building and Writing series. And I was like, what if I take these thoughts and can like bring them into text form? And then that like one thing led to another, and it's like, oh, I'm not doing that. I am like writing new content, and there's like a lot more to explore here than I originally anticipated.
Right.
So yeah, that's basically how this book came about, was just kind of like, I've always been interested in maps and world building. I worked with the World Building magazine team for like 2 years as well, just like learning from doing that. And yeah, eventually just got to a point where it's like, I have something to say here, and it's not going to be like perfect, I don't think, but it's going to be a space where people can, I think there's enough information and tangents and just like pieces of things in this book that there's going to be something in here for everybody, whether you want to get better at designing maps, whether you want to get better at thinking more critically about the world you're building and how to relate to that to the characters and all that kinds
Yeah.
of stuff.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. And I mean, obviously something that you're passionate about and able to bring in
What?
to, into this guide, right? But so, while you're looking at, let's say, and obviously not calling anybody out necessarily, but, when you're looking at that, either fantasy or sci-fi or any type of book that you pick up, what do you see authors getting wrong about world building, or maybe things that they just don't usually consider when they have this map in this world? What are some things you typically see that authors miss?
I don't like to phrase it in terms of getting something wrong or right. I think there's a lot of wiggle room, especially when you're dealing with science fiction and fantasy, because it's your world. Like, you can make it however you want. Plus, there are tons of errors on our real life map of Earth. Like the East River, for example, not a river.
Hmm.
It looks kind of like a river, and someone called it a river once, and that stuck. There's so many examples of that. And the Sahara Desert is translated to desert. It's extremely uninteresting. But, the point being that there's a lot of wiggle room and there's a lot of examples in real life of things
Yeah,
that are not deeply critically thought about.
fair enough. Yeah, fair.
Why is this place named the way it is? Because the guy who has that name showed up first.
For sure. Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I guess, yeah. And I guess, to say that, I guess maybe I should rephrase my question a little bit
But
here. Not what they get.
I was just going to say,
Yeah,
all
continue.
of that, all of that said, there are things that do bother me slightly. Do your thing, do whatever you want. It's great. I love it. But there are little things where it's so if you have, if your book is the size a book is, the map probably shouldn't be with perfect coastlines along the edges of the page, making a perfect rectangle or square. The rivers probably shouldn't be straight lines, little things like that. And they're
Mm,
not a big deal. And there are reasons why that may be the case. Maybe it makes sense in your world's history. But I think that by and large, those are things that people just didn't think about. And, just there was never that second pair of eyes to be like, well, that doesn't quite look like it was naturally built.
right, right. How about in terms of the story or the character development or that sort of thing? How a world or a map, or wherever the story is taking place, how does that play into the story in ways that authors sometimes don't think about, or don't consider as they're writing the story based on the map or the world that they've laid out for the reader?
Okay, so I think one of the cool things about this book that I was able to do was I got a chance, because I don't know everything and I only have my experience of different examples from across fantasy, sci-fi, all those kinds of things, of the different ways that maps are used and different world building devices and everything. So I was able to
Hmm.
bring on a whole bunch of other people. There's I want to say 20 or 30 people have contributed directly to this book, be it direct quotes or allowing me to use their maps as an example. There's another 10 or so on top of that who gave me permission to just use the artwork to show in a space where I talked about something it was displaying. One of the people who was able to give me some quotes and actually contribute to the text of the book, Ryan Cahill, he talked about how the landscape of Etheria really impacts the way people move around it. And I think travel is something people don't think about enough, or it's very often oh, well, we traveled down the road for this amount of time and our obstacle was the people who were also on the road or something,
Right.
or a creature that jumps out of the woods or something. And those are great, but the land itself can be an obstacle, or the water itself. One of the things Ryan talked about was how the way to get between the north part of the world and the south part of the world is very deadly. And if you have money, then you can make that crossing much easier. And if you don't, then you either can't cross or it's much, much more dangerous. And so there's this really interesting relationship between the landscape and the civilizations that want to make that travel and the economic realities of, there are people who can make it safely and people who can't.
Right.
I think that's a really fun example of how the landscape can very directly impact the story, because now if you have characters who need to make that passage, built into their economic situation or their, I guess their current economic situation, you have much different experiences.
For sure. Yeah. And you're building essentially the culture around the landscape, which is really the natural way that it would have unfolded anyway, right? Because if you've got these, boundaries, obviously, if you've got an area that is difficult to cross without some sort of, deep pockets behind you, that section is going to look a lot different than somewhere that is maybe easier to access.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
The land does not dictate culture, but it can steer it in certain directions. For example, like the mountains and the storms in Etheria dictate that danger of travel. The same way that like a city on a coast would have certain access to trade and other opportunities that a inland city without that access, they might not have as easily. Not saying they wouldn't have that. Like if there's anything that I've learned through the different various like research that I've done for this, people will go to the ends of the earth if there's something that they want in this location. There were cities and towns in the middle of a desert in the Middle East. I forget which one. Back to my cheat sheet. The Dasht Ilut Desert. Sorry.
I need an assistant. Pull that up.
I keep thinking of very specific examples, and then the last time I edited this book was in like January. It's kind of just been like I've been waiting on artwork and formatting and doing those final prep things since then. So it's been a minute.
You're good.
But
it's all good.
Yeah, the Dasht Ilut Desert in Iran, there's evidence of towns and cities that had existed like 3,000 years ago, like before that was ever comfortable with like modern plumbing and like access to water and air conditioning and all that kind of stuff. Like, I don't know if any of that even like works today, but the point being, like, these people they built these cities for a reason, and we think the reason is because they were way stations and trade hubs, because there was a profitable route that crossed that space to get access to the east and everything that was out there, all the goods that they had. And that's further explained by when the places that we think that they were trading with fell, all those cities just kind of went extinct.
Really? Okay. Yeah.
But just citing my sources here, because I know I'm being a little bit vague. I'm trying to remember all the details from when I last edited all this. But that was a lot of that info was taken from The World Between, an article from Archaeology Magazine by Andrew Lawler.
Right. Okay. Yeah, but I mean, so I think that speaks though to, when you're building your world in your, when you're building your world in your story, towns don't usually arbitrarily pop up.
Yes.
Especially if they're, in a hard to access region. These places popped up because this city popped up because it was on a trade route and people needed a place, to stop in between, kind of thing, right?
Yeah, like cities pop up because they are way stations or because they have access to a certain resource good there. It could be something as simple as there is good farmland here. It could be something like we have a lot of trees nearby, so we can cut them down and export them. It could be, as is the case with Shari Sakta and these places in the Dasht Ilut, way stations for these traders kind of coming through and needing a safe place to rest. That was the same reason Mali rose so quickly to power when gold was discovered there. And all the Europeans came seeking gold and tax them for their travels and everything. There's every place is there for a reason, and in your story you don't need to go into deep detail on that, but having like, just saying this is the town where they have a lot of sheep, and this is the town where they have all the farmland, and this is the city where all the industrialism is. Like, you can have these like little touch points that just help it feel a little more real. You don't have to go like quite as deep into all the history and everything if you don't want to.
For sure. I mean, but to that point too, like obviously that whatever industry or touch point that's there has to kind of make sense with how you've laid it out on the map, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't put a city that has become well known for its shipbuilding in the middle of a landlocked country. Like, that doesn't make any sense.
For sure. But so I mean, yeah, and
this is where the fun exceptions come into case.
Yeah.
Unless something has happened to the world where that place previously was not landlocked and the seas somehow receded, or something changed very dramatically. Maybe they have this history where the weird, unexplainable, like stupid idea actually makes a ton of sense.
Right. Yeah. And it's just, and it's about, thinking through what those reasons are, I guess, in those situations. Now, obviously that is, a pretty obvious example. You're not going to probably build ships in the middle of a landlocked country or in a mountain village or whatever. But are there certain things that you see that maybe aren't as obvious that trip authors up, that maybe that you've seen here or there that are like, that's probably not going to work in an area like that? And again, you don't have to like give us specifics, but it's just something that you see happen that authors maybe aren't considering in their worlds.
I can't think of any specific examples of people like specifically not doing this, but there is something that I don't see a lot of people actively commenting on, which is it's the climates of a place. This is something that I spend like a chapter on in the book as well, just kind of going through the different Köppen climate classifications and talking about what are the things you would find there and where do those exist in our world. So, for example, I feel like a lot of fantasy especially falls into the trap of being in a temperate location, very like European coded. You can sort of imagine why, like, so much fantasy is based in like medieval Europe, for example, or something like it.
Yeah, right.
Medieval and Europe is mostly temperate. I think that's part of why some of those couple of fantasies that are based in like a desert, for example, like that is a really, I think, exciting place to be just because it's so different looking. So like, trying, and I'm not saying that these temperate climates are not good to do. They can do some really interesting things, especially with seasons. Like deserts don't have seasons the way that a temperate climate will. So like, I think you can really utilize that in some interesting ways. Also, like, whatever your story is based on, I wouldn't like wrestle a different climate into it just because. Like, if your story is based on medieval Europe, just make it a temperate climate. It's fine. Unless I guess like unless you want to do more like a Spanish Iberian inspired thing, maybe it could be a little bit more Mediterranean or something. But like, this is not like you're doing it wrong, you should force it to be something else. Like, absolutely not. But think about, is that the right option? Would it be better? Would it make more sense or be more interesting to do something in a tropical climate or in a dry climate or in like a polar climate, for example? You can have interesting examples of those as well, where, the Himalayas are a polar climate on the equator. Like, that is a truly insane thing. You can have some really interesting combinations of climates. I think India is a great example of this. If you go look at the climate map of India, it is kind of all over the place. Along the western shore, it's very tropical. Along the eastern shore, it's much more dry. And along the mountains, of course, there's this polar climate in the Himalayas, and there's very sharp transitions because of these sharp elevation changes. So like, insert that into a fantasy story, and suddenly you have a very interesting place where, maybe the main character has to scale these mountains and endure all these different climates, and they see these different places where, you start where there is like savanna, for example, and like long grasses and all that kind of stuff, and then they ascend to the peaks, and it's like everything is ice, and there's like tundra foxes, and like all like the biggest plant is like a non-flowering bush that's like an inch tall or something, or like some mosses, because that's all that can grow there. I think those are just very interesting questions to ask.
For sure. Yeah, I think, I think it's easy to not consider even, how weather is going to change as your characters are going to move from one part of the country or kingdom or whatever, wherever they are, to the other, right? So I think keeping those things in mind, that, what they are experiencing on the coast isn't going to be the same as what they experience in the mountains. And I know intrinsically we know that, but I think it's, and I'm speaking for myself here too, it's easy to kind of like forget that that's, to mention that, hey, maybe I should talk about it raining because we're on a coast here, and just to keep that in mind, what the climate map of wherever I am,
and
what it looks like.
Like you just said, it doesn't have to be a drastic thing like what I was talking about. It can literally just be, and now it's raining, or and now it's snowing, or there's a light fog all of a sudden. Just like something to show different sides of the place that you're in, and it doesn't have to take more than a sentence or two.
Yeah, and I think because on the other end of that, I think it'd be easy to fall into the trap of over-explaining those, those types of things, rather than just saying, oh, the fog rolled in. Oh, because they were in this sort of climate, there was whatever pressure change. Like, you don't need to, go that detailed. I
completely
about it
agree.
either.
I think world building in general can easily fall into this trap of overdoing itself. The author either the author can, I think, share too much, even like they might just get like overexcited or over analytical. Really, like, and I try to stress this in the book as well, but basically my whole point with it is use this information to make your story about your characters better, to make it stand out more, to make it the maps for your story look better and stuff like that. The point is not replace all of your prose with world building. Like that would be ridiculous. The idea of the whole climates thing is like, take the knowledge and go into the writing armed with it so that you can insert it into places where it makes sense to do so. Or even, like I said, just asking the question, because that's really what this book is. It's a series of questions that are like, have you considered this thing? And if not, here's what it might look like. Here's some examples of what it might look like. Like we all, I think, intrinsically know about tectonic plates, for example, but we never talk about the way they move or anything, or like, earthquakes appear so rarely in our fiction, I think. And, the Broken Earth series, like, totally just embraces them, the tectonic plates and the earthquakes, and like turns it into a whole magic system. And like, it's so cool. So like, there are some really interesting things that you can do with these different concepts, or you can, like you said, it's just raining now.
Yeah. And I think even in so far as, and I've been thinking about this in some of my books, if you're going to put a mountain range somewhere, you don't have to like put it even you mention it in your story, but if you're building a map, mountains aren't just random. There's reasons, why mountains happen where they do. And I know the thought always goes through my head. Okay, well, what caused these mountains to be here? It maybe never originates, or not originates. It maybe never makes it into the story that is a thought, but I want there to be some sort of logic behind their placement in the map, or even in the world, right?
I think in a case like this, it's sort of like the story comes first. Like if your story demands that mountains have to be there, then you're going to put some mountains there. Then when it comes to the map, I think that's when it's really important to, mountains don't just, like you said, they don't just come out of thin air. They're made when two tectonic plates are smashing together in a very specific way. And they form like, honestly, fairly linear lines. Like they might curve and bend a little bit, but I mean, a lot of them are not that interestingly shaped, if I'm being honest. Then, there are all the exceptions. And a lot of those exceptions are related to volcanoes. And I think you can do some really fun things with volcanoes that I don't see enough of. Like, they're not all your Mount Dooms and stuff, but like volcanoes are just really interesting things because you can have a mountain appear out of nowhere, like just in the middle of a field because there is like magma coming up from that location. There's a hotspot or something. You can have, a society that has this really like rich agricultural economy because the ash from the mountain or from the volcano has like fertilized it so well and everything. Like we see that in places like Java, for example.
Right.
And all the different meanings behind a volcano culturally, all the different uses for things like obsidian. I mean, George R. R. Martin put obsidian as like a key item in his books. It's like there's so many different things you can do with that.
For sure.
And then this is where like the have the knowledge but don't necessarily explain all of it because it's not relevant to the story. But then you also have things like buttes and monodocs and like these basically like if the ground is here but then like this part of it is harder than this part of it, this piece gets eroded and the remaining hard part remains, and you get these like mountain-like things which emerge from the ground in really interesting ways. And it's like they don't form like regular mountains, so there is not a mountain range of these, but they may appear scattered across a plain or something. Like we see them across like North America in the Midwest, and we see them in Australia and some parts of they seem to all have different names, though, is one of the things that I found. Nobody can agree on what they're called.
Yeah, and and to your point, right? Like it's not that these elements are becoming the story, but it adds another layer to the story.
Yes.
You're adding in climate, you're adding in, past events, you're adding in, volcanic activity or whatever those layers look like. But I think that what it does is allow a level of realism. The world feels lived in, and it feels like there's some sort of purpose to what's
and some history to
kind
it,
of thing, right?
I think is really important.
Yeah. So the one thing that I shouldn't say always, the one thing that trips me up when writing is travel time. What do authors, because I mean, we're used to driving. So, when we're considering the distance from one place to the next, that's kind of how our culture in the West, at least, has been built up. But when you transfer that to, let's say, a culture that walks or is riding horse, how do you determine how far away things should be? Is there kind of a system that you use, or I guess anything along those lines of how to determine travel time? Because in my head, I'm like, okay, well, if they're going to walk there, it's going to take, I don't know how long it's going to take. Like I've used Google Maps to be like, okay, well, if it's about this far, how long does it say it's going to take me to walk there? But, are there systems that authors can use to kind of determine a realistic travel time?
Yes. I would say it starts, though, with how far away does it need to be? Like, again, this comes back to the story you're telling. If you need the characters to get there quickly, find a way to get them there quickly. If you need them to struggle through a forest for some reason, then make that a winding trail through some forest they can get lost in. The story really has to come first. That being said, there are some like kind of shortcut numbers I think you can look at. Like the Google Maps for walking, I think, is a good starting point, just to see like how long it would take to get somewhere, assuming you had like roads to walk on, for example. And we all, I think somewhat instinctively know how long it takes to walk somewhere. Like we've all had to walk somewhere, I would hope.
I mean, I've never had to walk to the next town over, though. That's the the issue I struggle with, right?
But yeah, so like, there are some rough numbers. Yeah, so some rough numbers, you can travel on horseback roughly 10 miles in a day, like, or 16 kilometers. Like and again, though, like that also depends on how hard you're riding the horse. Like, are you galloping? Are you willing to sacrifice duration of time traveling for the speed of that travel? Or are you just kind of like on the horse at a casual pace. And like there's a lot of interesting things. Like if you look at, I think North America is a really good example of this actually, because you can see when it was first, like when Europeans first arrived and they began settling and building towns and stuff, a lot of those towns are about like 5 to 10 miles away. And that's because people needed to be able to travel between them easily. As you get further out west, people are not on horseback as much. They're more like, or they have horses more often, or they have cars to drive, or something of that nature. So as travel gets easier, as we move out west, those cities and towns become further apart, and they become more accustomed to the average travel one can do in a day when they have access to those things.
Okay, yeah.
I think it's a really cool real life example of like how the way we build cities and towns has changed over time based on our ability to travel and based on what kinds of ways we travel. Like a lot of those old towns and stuff were built on railways because that was where people were coming through. We don't do that at least in the US anymore, unfortunately. And so some of those towns have basically gone extinct because those modes of travel don't exist anymore. And instead it's become more like car centric, for example, or plane centric. And so, the big centers, the big cities expand.
Right.
Same questions really for you can very easily look up the average speed of different types of ships. Like, are you looking at a schooner? Are you looking at a cog ship or something? Like, you can go find those on like various websites and stuff.
Yeah.
And, estimate that. I think at the end of the day, the golden rule is to make it feel like it's right, because most readers are not going to dig in that deep.
Right.
But they will notice if like, every moment of travel happens like that, or if, if they're walking
if suddenly
5 miles,
they're across the kingdom, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a real final season of Game of Thrones situation where everybody is kind of everywhere all at once. And they'll also notice conversely if like people are taking a 5-mile walk to the next town over, and that takes 10 chapters. Like, I don't know. Like, there's got to be some real obstacles in the way for that to make sense to me.
Yeah, or to be interesting, right? I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, story comes first, but like there are different ways. Like you can go look up the average travel speed of these different things. Consider how quickly you're traveling in those methods. Like if you're dealing with horses, for example, which I know a lot of people who write fantasy are, it's really important to consider how hard you're riding that horse, because that means I can either take that's the difference between I can ride this horse the entire distance, or I'm going to ride it as far as I find another town and I have to trade it out for a new fresh horse. And then like find a way to continue that way, which might be easy. Maybe the main character doesn't have the money for that. Maybe, they can't find access to another horse. That presents a new challenge.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of times we get so excited about the plot. We get so excited about, these cool, maybe we've thought about the cities that we're building, about the stuff in between sometimes, or how we're getting those realistic from one place to the other realistically, not, riding our horse into the ground or, that sort of thing, I think sometimes takes the back seat. So it's, good to consider those things, up front while we're building our world and what that's going to look like.
And it's, again, one of those things that like doesn't have to take a lot of time on the page. Like you could, it's the difference of describing the rider, taking their time and letting the horse make sure it rests versus, and I stopped at the next town, picked up a new horse and kept going. That's it. Yeah. Like, make it sound better than that, but like, that's all you got to do. Like, it's so many of these concepts, even though they take a lot of time to figure out the details of, can be boiled down to like a very simple line. And you don't have to know the specific speed or distance, just so long as if this would reasonably take, let's say, roughly 2 days of travel, then you describe quickly 2 days of travel.
Yeah. And I think the other piece of that that I sometimes gloss over is consistency. And, if it takes this amount of time to get from this place to this place and this place to the next place needs to make sense relative to the time I just spent getting to the first place.
That's one of the reasons why I've always loved making maps, because that helps me be consistent. If I can see, all right, well, these two places are a short distance away. Now these two places are a much larger distance away. It's very helpful for me.
Totally. I can definitely see that. And to that point, I think perhaps I should put together a map before I do that, because a lot of times I don't. But I think that would help me with a number of those challenges. So I do appreciate that.
One thing I'll say, I think it's really helpful to do that, but I think it's also really easy to fall into the trap of I'm going to make the map right now. No, grab a sticky note, grab a piece of scrap paper, and then just like put down the locations roughly of each town or something. Like you can fix it later. But I think just having a reference for yourself is really helpful.
Yeah, that's a great point, because sometimes us authors get, shiny object syndrome. Oh, I'm going to draw a map now. And you draw out the most perfect map that you end up throwing out half of the details later anyway. It's very easy to distract yourself from your writing by doing things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I fall into that trap all the time as well. I absolutely do. But it is one of those things where, like, if I don't have time for it, I am perfectly happy to just do a quick sketch and then I'll fix it later. And I think, I make my own maps. I make maps for other people. I'm very comfortable making them. I know there's a lot of people who aren't. And so I think it's really important to just keep that in mind, where like you don't have to be a illustrator to do this. Like, I'm not kidding, just like grab the nearest piece of paper and just sketch on it and like get the approximation. You never have to show it to anybody, but it will help you keep those things consistent.
For sure. Yeah. But and to that point, I think for those of us who maybe are not that great with map building, or, to keep in mind some of these points that you've made about topography, climate, historical development of why these places are where they are good things for us to keep in the back of our minds as we're taking out the sticky notes and mapping things out and then rearranging as the story develops around them.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think at a minimum, it's really helpful to have like one thing the town is known for, or was built for, or has a history, is like something in the history it's like important about. I think that can be that can be very helpful, and again, doesn't take a lot of space on the page. You can, of course, go into much more detail. I spoke with, there were a couple of people I spoke with, Dewey Hargreaves and Daniel Hasenbos, who are both cartographers who I consulted on this book as well. And they both brought up things like, why was the town built? What is its history? What are its exports, imports? I think it was Dewey who brought up, does it have a sewer system? Like, like all these like little things that are like very important to the city. Absolutely. There's I think a really interesting case study in New York City, which has gone through so many phases in its life, where it was a place where local Native American tribes would come seasonally and then they would leave. And it was like never a major place for them, but of course it was part of their territory. And then it was New Amsterdam for a while. And it was this very, very small trade town. And of course, when it became English and it became New York, it began to expand exponentially. And you get to this point where they had to declare eminent domain and begin to like tear things down so that they could build it back up in a more efficient way to make better use of the space. And you see that again, I believe it was in the 50s or 60s, as the interstate system began to emerge in the US. And again, they're tearing things down in order to build things more efficiently for the much higher population, both here and across the states at that point in general. But then, of course, the question is, what are they tearing down? Like who's becoming eminent domain? In the 50s and 60s, it was very much the slums, the lower economic areas, people who really couldn't argue or fight back too much. And, you get this really interesting and unfortunate history of these places that have been torn apart and torn down and communities displaced or separated. And there's some places are trying to repair that. This was not a thing that just happened in New York City. Some places are just kind of like, it happened and we have to move on and we make the best of the situation. And of course, things are continuing to evolve as the city continues to grow and different economic factors occur and everything.
Yeah.
You can really, really go into depth.
For sure. But yeah, but all of those things have obviously had an impact on the cultural and societal impact of the city today, right? So, I mean, we often don't think of some of those historical events when we're building the cities of our books, but there's a lot there and a lot that impacts, the dynamics of the city as it is, in the present moment.
Yeah, I think for storytelling, specificity can be really helpful. And you don't need a series of specific things like what I just gave. But like if you have a character who is not in the upper echelon economic class or whatever, they are in more the slums. They are in more so many of our stories are of that person who has to rise up and become the hero and everything. So let's just roll with that for a moment.
Yeah.
If you have somebody like that, giving them a specific reason why they've ended up there or why their family ended up there or why it's become so difficult for them to rise to a higher station in life or escape the city for some reason, I think giving us like one piece of history to latch onto, one economic situation to latch onto, or maybe it could be like a societal problem where maybe at this point in time people haven't developed something that helps people advance. It's a more medieval situation, for example, where there's the person in charge and they own everything and then you rent it. There's a lot of different ways you can approach it, I think, and having something to latch onto helps a lot.
For sure. Yeah. Cool. That is, I think, a great place for us to kind of end things. I think that is a great, finishing note for us. But for our listeners, can you just let them know again where they could find you and grab a copy of your upcoming book, and when is the release date again?
June 30th is the ebook release. You can go pick it up wherever you read your ebooks. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo. I think it'll be on Kobo Plus as well if you have that. And Lunar Books, if you want to support a small indie bookstore, they have it as well. They're awesome. Australian-based, but they give their ebooks out to anybody. Yeah, go check it out. Yeah, and then if you're looking for the hardcover, maybe by the time this releases, there'll be more info. I don't know. Check my website. Check my newsletter. There'll be something. Hopefully, I'm hoping by the end of the summer or beginning of autumn, Northern Hemisphere, I'll have either a date or it'll be out
for sure. Yeah. Hey, I'll link all of your details in the show notes so people can follow you, and that way, when you do have that announcement, they're able to go and pre-order it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, well, and thank you so much for coming on the show and chatting with me. Tons of information. I know we probably just skimmed the surface of world building and maps, but like I said, I appreciate it, Adam, and we will chat again soon. And I thank you for following the show. I know that you've been a listener since we rebranded, and you're always in the comment section. I appreciate that so much. Yeah, thank you again, and we will chat soon.
Sounds great.